Um, Thank you, Andre, and it's an honor to join you here. And thank you, first of all, for your kind interest in Ukraine and your time and dedication, to be in solidarity with us. Um, Andre, again, thank you for inviting me to this to join this event. I probably would like to start with also a little bit of a kind of family perspective or historical perspective, because I think even this name of the event, Russian clause. In Ukraine is symbolic, and should be looked at, I think, everything in terms of our relationship between Ukraine and Russia, or the evolution of Ukraine, should be taken from a certain perspective. I was born in Lviv, Ukraine, then Soviet Union in 1977, when Leonid Brezhnev was still the first head of the Communist Party at the time. I was born in a family of Ukrainian Catholics, or Catholics of Byzantine Rite, in a family that spent years in gulags for their efforts to help Ukraine's independence during and after World War II. My family was practicing religion, and Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was then working undercover, basically in the Soviet Union. So I was baptized at home. I could not mention the names of my godparents at school, otherwise my parents would lose their jobs, or worse. I could never speak to my schoolmates about the fact that we regularly had liturgy in our apartment when a Greek Catholic priest, who probably had a very different official occupation in the Soviet Union, would come to our home on Sunday so that we could pray together. I still remember the time when, in a time like this, before Christmas or during Christmas, when we would have family dinner, which we kind of called Holy Supper before Christmas, my dad would make sure that the curtains are drawn very closely, so no KGB could suspect us of doing anything that was considered illegal in the Soviet time. So I remember vividly those times, and I'm happy that I had the privilege to, in a way, get to know them, because I can see the difference, and the huge difference where Ukraine is now as a free and democratic country, and a country where anyone can, practice their freedom of consciousness and religion. Unfortunately, just not in the occupied territories of Ukraine right now. I had the privilege of growing up in a country in which, I could see the freedom flourish. I had the privilege to witness the reawakening of my fellow, my fellow compatriots and our nation in the 80s, and all throughout the before and after the Chernobyl disaster, as well as coming out of the church, working from undercover, and all finally proving that this time of Soviet Union, of making sure that this human suffering by the Soviet system, the system of fear that was created in which everyone lived, that it was over. And I then had the privilege to live in Ukraine and then do my studies in the United States and America, both high school and master's degree under Edmund Muskie Fellowship, and commit to come back home and develop Ukraine's democracy and market economy, which I tried to do. And in the last 17 years have built a strategic strategy and communications consulting business with 70 people working now in Ukraine, in Kiev, and servicing over 40 clients on an annual basis, as well as contributing to shaping Ukraine's civil society in the years following the Revolution of Dignity. I think that since the breakup of the Soviet Union, to many people in the West, Ukraine was still an unknown and kind of an unexpected nation. Although I think in the last 6 years, and if you just think about it, that this Russian-Ukrainian recent war has lasted longer than the Second World War. It's been 6 years since this empire attacked Ukraine. And now I think there is more clarity that Ukraine is clearly not Russia, but a distinct country that, unlike our aggressive neighbor, treasures freedom, human dignity, and democracy. For me, as Andre had mentioned also, Ukraine is probably one of the most resilient nations in the world. I think we've had our share of suffering all throughout our ancient history, since times long time ago. And I think 20th century has been especially not kind to Ukrainians. In many times we had to defend ourselves. Unfortunately, we did lose a lot of Ukraine's human potential because we resisted in the 20th and 30s of last century the collectivization and rapid industrialization efforts of Stalin, and millions of people were starved to death. Over 6 million people in Ukraine died and lost their lives during the Second World War. I think around 3 million of them in different armies and 3 million civilians. And unfortunately, because Ukrainians resisted Stalin's policies and Soviet policies, even after the Second World War, when I think the Allies sort of had the appreciation of Iron Curtain divvying the world up. But for us, it meant that we were continuing to lose our opinion leaders, our public leaders, our intellectuals, our artists, who were standing for both national liberation and human rights, even in the Soviet times. We've been known as the breadbasket of Europe 100 years ago, but today we are one of the largest in the world agricultural producers still, but also number 4 nation in the world with IT outsourcing, with a lot of exciting startups, with a creative economy developing, and I think for the first time in all years, a class of Ukrainian entrepreneurs who are really beginning to treat Ukraine not as a resource, but as a state in which their companies and their organizations and the people who depend on them, can grow. Our, struggle, I think, has had really its impact, especially has been witnessed in the last, 6 years because of probably the most intense period of our modern history. Someone said that there are sometimes decades, when nothing happens, and then there are weeks or months when decades happen. And I think this can really be applied to what we have lived through in the winter months of 2013, 2014. I think there is a reason why they're called the winter on fire, or winter that changed us. Because it was the time when Russian-backed Yanukovych government went against the will of the Ukrainian people, who expressed their willingness to have the association agreement with the European Union, who were kind of strengthening Ukraine's aspiration to become a more active member of the European community. And when Yanukovych decided against that. Moreover, when the young protesters were, violence was applied to them, when they opposed it, the nation rose. People were coming to Kiev from all over the place. I think for anyone who has been to Maidan, it will always be the privilege to know what all we have experienced in those dramatic months of this time. And I think this was the moment of awakening for the nation. It was the moment after which that government had no longer a chance to lead this nation of people who were reclaiming their dignity, and were not willing to sacrifice the chance that a group of corrupt crooks would lead them further. Unfortunately, the toll and the cost was humongous as well. We've lost, I think, the best members of our community. Now we call them a heavenly 100. Among them, there is a student of the Ukrainian Catholic University, Bogdan Sulchanik. These were very courageous people who, even after 3-4 months of resistance, they basically went up against Russian and government-backed snipers on Institutska Street in Kiev to be killed, and they knew they would be killed. But I think they sacrificed themselves so that others would follow and would complete the task of reshaping Ukraine after the revolution of dignity. That reshaping had started, but we were attacked at our moment of grief as we were burying and mourning the friends we have lost. Russia annexed Crimea and then started war in Donbass. And Ukraine had to face, very many tasks all at the same time. On one hand, we had to recreate the army that would defend our borders. And in this sense, I think it's amazing that Ukrainians have raised and funded and created and enlisted as volunteers initially. Many those soldiers are now part of the professional army, a 250,000 member army that until today has to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and our borders. I think we've also seen how this sacrifice of Heavenly Hundred and what people have felt placed a bigger responsibility on Ukrainians in terms of feeling, personal responsibility for the country we are building. So we saw a great number of people from different tracks and walks of life, from, businessmen leaving their businesses and joining the civil service or joining the army to serve either Ukraine's independence in terms of changing or defending our interests. And in the last 6 years, we saw probably already several generations or several sort of streams of people who did that and who continue to do so. I think that there have been, many struggles, especially for people who have had to live in the occupied territories or to suffer from Russia's attack, because really this unprovoked attack has cost us 13,000 lives of civilians and our soldiers, as well as 1.5 million people who have been mostly internally displaced, who had to, leave their homes and find a new possibility to live somewhere else in Ukraine. And of course, the persecutions and torture and political disappearance and things that are applied to people who are living in occupied territories of Crimea and Donbass, they're unspeakable. When you listen to the stories of those political prisoners that we were able to bring home, like Oleg Sentsov, or people like Marchenko, who are still in Russia or other places, when you hear of how many violations of human rights there are in these occupied areas of Ukraine. It's about 8% of our territory in Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and in Crimea. There are grave human rights violations that affect the right to life, liberty, security, practicing again freedom of consciousness, or ability to get truthful information about facts affecting one's life. This is all unfortunately continuing to happen. Of course, Ukraine has been suffering economically. I mean, it's difficult to recreate and rebuild a successful country immediately having a war on the other side. So economically, we've had hardships in terms of affecting Ukraine's budget, and the cost of war has been negative in its toll, that around 10 million people in Ukraine do live in poverty. And just recently, Ukraine's human rights ombudsman cited $75 as minimal cost of living in Ukraine, and minimal salaries $176 per month. So even withstanding the fact that we do know that Ukraine has a shadow economy, and it's in fact bigger, and no statistics can be fully trusted, but still it's a long way to go and build a really prosperous state where Ukrainian people can have a dignified life. But at the same time, we see that long-term Ukrainians are transforming, and their values are transforming. There was a recent world values study that cites how Ukraine's optimism is growing, and Ukrainians do believe in the right course of Ukraine as a country that treasures democracy and wants to continue to live as a democratic state that further aligns itself with the European Union and NATO, and also a country that trusts each other more, which I think is probably the most important measure for me. In 2011, only 23% of Ukrainians trusted each other, and you cannot, build the prosperous state with such level of of trust. It can really be explained by so many things in our history, as Andrei had mentioned. We've inherited this level of mistrust created by Soviet Union, who lied constantly. We've had to live through this empire of fear, the burden and trauma of which was that people only trusted those in power to whom they would, bribe. We've also had to go through this period of when people would not believe in themselves, in their own ability to transform, to interpret, to earn good living, and would always rely on the state, would kind of be paternalistic in the sense that you would always expect somebody else to take care of you. But now it's changing. It's in the last 9 years, it's about 30% of Ukrainians that are trusting each other. This is growing, and the level of optimism, despite all of these circumstances, is there. So I'm happy to comment a little bit more on the information space and how it evolves around Ukrainians. But I would stop here and just say that given the perspective where we're coming from and where we are in 2021, I'm very, very optimistic, even though there are many challenges, and only in deep solidarity and in deep faith it's possible to overcome them.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you very much for your opening comments. I'm sure we'll have lots of follow-up questions coming up. I've asked Father Brendan to field. He'll be able to read them out in the event that people are not able to connect directly with their microphones. It's true. I remember a very famous quote by Edward Lucas, who was speaking about Ukraine in 2014, saying that it was like a ship on fire, sinking and without a captain. And very few people had any hope at all for Ukraine being able to right itself. But in fact, it did right itself, and it set sail for Europe. And I think this is a very strong testament, again, to this element of resilience we spoke about. And I think what you touched on about the Maidan, about if you watch the videos, and we'll see the video later, but if you remember watching the news footage of the people who were on Maidan, it was everyone from infants to seniors and everyone in between. It wasn't limited to just some rebellious students. It was really a representation of all of the segments of society in Ukraine. And I think that's very important. One other element, very important element, which brings us into our segue to the Archbishop Metropolitan, I think is also the role of religion, the religion and what role it has played in Ukraine's resilience. I too, like Natalia and like many others, come from a family where my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather, and for 260 some years before then, all of the men were, Luzhnitsky men were priests. And so we're quite aware of what faith allows you to do and what faith allows you to achieve. And faith as also the cornerstone of survival in a terrible, terrible situation. And I think this is something too that Archbishop, I'd like you to speak about the role of the churches. I remember watching the videos, many of you probably have seen them, of the common religious services among different faiths on the Maidan. I know that you took part in some of them. And I'd like you to perhaps begin your speech here with the role of the churches during the Revolution of Dignity and also their involvement with civil society. It's now my great honor, Your Grace, to give you the floor.
Thank you, Andrei, and I thank you, dear Dominican brothers, for the work that you do for peace and for this program specifically. Can you hear me well? Can everybody hear me? Good. For those who are trying to understand a different part of the world, it's difficult. I don't know too much about the different regions of China or maybe Africa. I've never been there. And most people in the world haven't been to Ukraine. Right now, as Andrei and Natalia have explained, Ukraine is in the 7th year of a war, of an invasion, defending its independence. Now, I don't know how many of you have a sense of how big Ukraine is. In fact, it is the biggest country that is fully in Europe. There's no country in Europe that geographically is bigger in Europe. Ukraine is bigger than continental France. And of course, Russia is bigger, but Russia extends into Asia. And what is the population of Ukraine? Anybody want to guess? It's a little over 40 million now. It was at the time of independence about 30 years ago or 28 years ago, it was 52 million. So Ukraine is a geographic phenomenon that is big. It's big in Europe. It's as big as Texas. But it has become very global because more than 10 million Ukrainians have left the country. And for example, in the European Union, there are 3 million new Ukrainian immigrants. There's probably between 300 and 400,000 new Ukrainians in the United States, and they're all over the place. It's also good to know that it has a bit of a history. Modern contemporary Ukrainian independence is since 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart. And it was actually the declaration of independence of Ukraine that was the last nail in the coffin of the Soviet system. When Ukraine became independent, the Soviet Union fell apart in December of 1991. Ukraine is right there on the border between European East and West. In fact, the center of Europe is found in Western Ukraine, in the Carpathian Mountains. It's bordered by Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Belarus, which is now in turmoil, and it has a large border with Russia and the Black Sea. Turkey is on the other side of the Black Sea. So all these countries have interacted with Ukraine for centuries, these spheres of influence. And for many of these centuries, Ukrainians did not have independence. They were part of neighboring empires, whether it was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, whether it was the Mongol Empire, the Muscovite, later Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and Ukrainian lands were in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, and Romania. What is one factor of Ukrainian identity that spans a millennium? It's the church. If Ukraine lacked government institutions of its own making, if it lacked an independent state at different times, sometimes for centuries, it has had for 1,000 years a church life that is in continuity. The continuity might be a little meandering, it might be broken, but there are direct lines of continuity over 1,000 years, which no other institutions in Ukraine have. In the 20th century, the churches were severely repressed by the communist atheist authorities, all churches. Most of the churches, including the Orthodox Church, were pressed and had only a limited existence. There were only a few communities, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic community, the Eastern Catholics in Ukraine, were one of the few that were totally illegal. The church was completely suppressed. All bishops and much of the clergy were sent to the Siberia. All bishops were either killed or sent to Siberia. And the church remained in the underground. What did this mean? This meant that there was a very high price paid for its existence. the church was reduced by 90% in the underground, depending if you call the clergy was reduced by 90%. The active faithful, like Natalia said, who had liturgy in their houses, were only 1% of the 1930s population. But that 1% of the population, Natalia's family, the 10% of the clergy who were underground, they stood in stark contrast to the Soviet totalitarian regime. In fact, they were free in a strange way, because they were not collaborating. Most of the population willy-nilly had to collaborate. And when independence came in 1991 and the Christians came out from the underground, they had great moral authority because they had not collaborated with the killers. In Ukraine, in the 20th century, about 15 million people were killed or died a natural death. That legacy of maintaining a social doctrine, let's say a philosophy of society, of how people should live together justly, which touched upon political questions, human rights, economics, social policy, that doctrine was carried into the experience of independent Ukraine. And in 2013, and 14, at the time of the Revolution of Dignity, it was the churches that came together, explicitly or implicitly using Christian social doctrine, much of it being explicitly Catholic social doctrine. Because the Catholic Church has developed over the last 150 years an elaborate system of social, let's say, understanding about politics, labor, economics, industry, medicine, etc. The churches came together, and all of Ukraine's religious communities, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, they were all together on the stage in the protest movement, standing for basically a few basic principles. One is that the people have a right to express their opinion. Two, that no violence should be used by anybody. Three, that any language dividing the country is immoral. And four, that dialogue is the only way out. All of the religious communities for 2 months stood together on this platform, and they stood together visibly in front of 1 million people in the square of Kyiv on Sundays, week after week. And during the week, if you can imagine, in below zero weather, all of December, all of January, and much of February, the churches were there present, and there was prayer in the main square of the city through the night on the hour. 10 o'clock, 11 p.m., 12, 1, 2, 4, 6 a.m. The religious communities came together, and the churches were with the people in this incredible act of solidarity. And fundamental Catholic, Christian, Orthodox principles came to be embodied in this protest movement. It was a movement of solidarity. It was a movement of subsidiarity. You know that in Christian Catholic social doctrine, subsidiarity is a very important principle. It's actually something that, for example, the Catholic Church is kind of generously shared with the European Union and with other theorists, means, what does subsidiarity mean? You decide things on the lowest level. This movement of protest, which lasted through the winter with an encampment of 5,000 people living in the main square, with sanitary conditions, people cooking meals for each other, sharing clothes, responding to medical needs, developing a university on the Maidan, poetry, and a continuous rock concert that went through the days with musicians of different genres, keeping up the spirit in the freezing cold, and throughout the intermittent attempts of the government to break up this protest. It was quite amazing to see the generosity of people. It was Jesus incarnate when rich people in Mercedes would drive up and open up their trunk and carry out boxes of bread and barrels of borscht. On the Maidan, somebody who could come from the distant part of the country to protest at 11 p.m. could meet somebody and say, you know, I'm freezing. Do you have a place? Can you give me, do you have any ideas where I could stay? And the person would pull out the keys of their apartment, give the address and say, here are the keys to my house, go spend the night there. But in the end, this Maidan, this protest, Maidan means square. It's actually an Arabic word. So Euro Maidan means Euro square, the square of the Euro protest. This Maidan of dignity started as a Euro Maidan. It was a question of political and, let's say, social association with the European community, which was thwarted by Russia. But then it became a Maidan of dignity. And one of the places where a discourse of dignity as a social concept developed was at the Ukrainian Catholic University. The university has dignity, human dignity, as part of its mission statement. And actually, the university organized talks right before the Maidan entitled, "How much does our dignity cost? How much is our dignity worth?" And the transition, whether it was explicit or implicit around the Maidan, was from a Euro Maidan to where, let's say, constitutional laws and international agreements and legal guarantees of human rights were the main concern. It evolved into something that was focused on the inalienable dignity of every human being. We Christians would say a God-given dignity, a dignity that is sacred. And the sacredness of each individual person. And this solidarity, which was a communion that led to a community that led to communion, was profoundly religious. It was profoundly spiritual. It was profoundly evangelical. Whether those living it, bringing it into life, could really name it as such. So there's a 1,000-year history. There's 100 years in the 20th century where the churches maintained identity and principle that the communist regime started to try to thwart. And in the 30 years of independence, when a Christian social doctrine came to be articulated, it became the underpinning of a movement of a different name with maybe different explicit articulation, but one in which the life of the Gospels, the Spirit of Christ, were its very heart, the inalienable, sacred dignity of every human being.
Thank you, Your Grace, for these very powerful words. I think that resonate with us very, very strongly. Probably going from the ideas that you presented now, we need to, or it would be fitting to pass to the video that Andrew Koch is the director and producer of, which is Generation Maidan, to maybe give people a better idea of what was happening and the extreme violence that these peaceful demonstrators, as you said, that were there, united in some form of spirituality, this idea of this inalienable dignity, reclaiming this, and the reaction of this corrupt regime, which could not have been more of the opposite. So perhaps, Andrew, would you please say a few words prior to us or me maybe trying to share the video? I hope it works. We never know with these online webinars. But Andrew, would you please maybe just follow up on what the Archbishop said and segue into your film and indicate maybe what was the motivation and how this came about, and then we'll show the trailer for the first movie, Generation Maidan. It's a great pleasure now to give you the floor, Andrew.
Thank you. My name is Andrew Takat. I'm an independent filmmaker, but at the time when these events were happening, I was finishing stints of about 20 years of working for network television in the United States. So the last sort of assignments I had were with CNN and then with Channel 4 and in UK. And I had been trying to, bring the attention of the world to, Maidan, for some time, as the events had happened, just like you see in Belarus, people, pay attention to the first, week, 2 weeks, and then it fades away, but the struggle continues. And it wasn't until the massacre that happened in February that I was actually assigned to go. My phone rang off the hook, and I was told by Channel 4 UK, can you get on the next plane? Because all the foreign crews were either in lockdown. It was impossible to do any filming, reporting. And I had already had established contact with a group of young filmmakers called Babylon 13. They were young filmmakers who, throughout the revolution, had taken it upon themselves to film every single day, one day, and keep the equipment in a secret location. So they had the chronicle of events. And I contacted them first saying, look, this is our assignment. We're working with Channel 4. We landed in Lviv, that weekend of the massacres, and then we had to chase Yanukovych. We went to Donetsk and so on for about a week. And then afterwards, I returned to Maidan and looked at like 2 days of their footage and isolated the strongest personalities I could. This is still when the fires are still smoldering, and interviewed them, at the barricades. So that's the first half of the film. And then the second half of this film, because it was a year, it's called Generation Maidan, a year of war, a revolution and war. The second half is following how did the war begin? Because it happened so, it was one process, when the revolution succeeded, the war began, which was very much, sort of the empire striking back. And I was, again, fortunate enough that I was able to follow one of the young activists who was a theater director who actually had gone to Slavyansk to the front line and had been in prison by the separatists. And I went back to him to see the prison where he had been kept, beaten, so on. And that formed the second, basis of the second half of the film. So I will show you that first. It's a 2-minute promo. The full hour-and-a-half film is available on Vimeo online. It's been at the Geneva Film Festival, Human Rights Film Festival. It was at the Bogota Human Rights Film Festival. So there is a Spanish version as well. So if you can play the trailer, then I'll be happy to take questions and talk about the second film.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I'm sorry, I should have given a bit more of a wider kind of introduction to who you are, and it is quite an honor to have you here. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that Andrew was a producer for CNN, for CBS 60 Minutes, and you've won, I think, 8 Emmy Awards. Is that correct, for the work that you've done over your career?
Yes.
So it really is an honor to have you here. I beg for your indulgence now. We're going to try to make this work with the screen sharing, so I'll keep my sound on. Please, everybody, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it and if you can see it. Okay, thank you. Can everyone see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yep.
That didn't work. All right. Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you good.
I think you need to go back.
I can't hear myself. Hold on a second. Let's try to do this again.
They beat anyone they could lay their hands on. It was scary to watch. My skull was fractured and a piece is missing.
We couldn't just open up our arms so our enemies could shoot us.
Your cameraman is a hero. He was hit by a bullet and we just stitched him up when the first body is brought in. He jumps to his feet and asks, "Can I shoot?" I say, "Shoot, for history's sake." No one expected our children and grandchildren to end up in a war zone.
Unfortunately, we lost the tank to a large mine which had been set up by the separatists. These are now Spetsnaz, special forces from the Russian army. It is critically life important for Ukraine to fend off the aggression, to reform society, and to build a normal country.
If everybody will be controlled by fear, we will lose the chance to change the system. This is the fight of our generation.
So I can continue as a segue to the next film, or do you want me to take questions about this one?
Why don't you comment on that a little further, if you can? I seem to be having some technical difficulties.
Okay, so, clearly this was a film that was sort of history, ripped out, the pages of history were happening, in front of the camera. And it was just important to isolate it into 5 or 6 characters and follow them over the course of the 6 months and really a year as the events unfolded. But ironically, after I put this film away, and it was about a year later, on the basis of this film, I was called by the Canada-Ukraine Foundation, and they asked me, I said, well, we've discovered a trove of interesting writings by a journalist who had documented the Holodomor, which was the great famine in 1930s during the Stalinist period. And she was Rhea Kleiman, as a person that was absolutely unknown to history. And I, having worked, pretty much in the present tense, had, never, imagined that I would be doing historical documentaries. And I said, well, and I was actually working in Kenya, and I said, well, I'll take a look at, the writing and, submit a proposal, because it was a competition for a grant. And, I found it very captivating, because here was a woman who had gone to the Soviet Union as a committed communist and had, then, through the strength of her own professional convictions, gone north, to be the first reporter to describe the Gulag system in Kem. And before she could be evicted, because she was evicted for those writings, she heard rumors of famine in the South. And she happened to be also Walter Duranty's assistant, who was the New York Times reporter accused of covering up the famine. And basically, she then proceeded with two other American women drive through Ukraine at the very beginning of the famine. We're talking about the end of 1932. And none of her writing had really been, understood, discovered for many years since it had appeared. So the challenge in making this film was twofold. Here was a story that is really one of the fundamental, kind of origin stories of modern Ukraine, in terms of its identity, in terms of how it understands its historical position and its neighbors, and why it must fight to be an independent nation. Told by a foreigner who, basically was one of the only honest outsiders who described it, and had left no trace except these number of articles. So that was the challenge. How do you make a film based on such scanty material? My feeling was that I had to go and find every single photograph, every single film that related to those events. I had to find, in terms of the archives, it happened to be in the Catholic archives of Cardinal Enitzker that the only photos of the Holodomor existed. And by tracing that trail, I was able to find the great-granddaughter of the photographer, who was an Austrian engineer who had stayed in Soviet Union after World War I, when he was a prisoner, and had worked in the chemical industry, and then had worked in Kharkiv and took the only known credible photos of the Holodomor. So that was one basis of finding this material in the direct source, finding the great-granddaughter who had a notebook that had never before been seen, and finding all the archives in Kyiv of what existed from that period. But I always felt that a film, if it's only historical, can be dismissed, as this is a terrible disaster that happened, and many countries have suffered similar disasters. You have to have also a human element, an emotional element, as a filmmaker, to draw people in. And because of the fact I'd been, through the Maidan at the end and the beginning of the war, I felt that we had to have a parallel story with a victim of today's war. And that was a family, through activists I'd met during the Maidan period, a family whose the main breadwinner was a soldier and was taken prisoner while his wife was still pregnant with the second child. And so for over 4 years, we followed the second story as well. And then to try to marry the two into a narrative that tells a personal narrative, a national narrative, and makes for gripping film and television, that was the assignment. So the film is called Hunger for Truth. It was just shown in Ukraine on national television 2 days ago. It's been on Polish television. It's been on, it will be on Czech television next year. And it's been on numerous film festivals. You can see it online, on Vimeo online as well. I've made it available, for like $1 now, so anybody can see it. And there is a full French version as well, because it was screened by INALCO and the Ukrainian embassy in Paris. They are screening the 50-minute version, which is just the historical version. But do you think, Ndigi, that you've surmounted the technical problems? Do you think?
I hope so. Were you able to see the video before?
Yeah, it played fine.
Okay, good. So
I mean, it skips, but in any case, anybody who's interested can see the promos. You know, they're freely available online. You just have to search Hunger for Truth, and you'll be thrown to my Vimeo site, and you can see it. But why don't you play it, and then I can answer.
Let me try again, everyone. Keep your fingers crossed.
To Comrade M. Yagoda, you accused me of sending out alarming reports about the famine in the villages. But the children in the villages of the Ukraine were eating grass when I saw them a few months ago. Theft of a few ears of corn from the collective farms is punishable by death. You have successfully muzzled and cowed the Russian people by bullying and terror. You tried this on me, but I recant nothing.
Мене звати Катерина Глондар, дружина військовополоненого Сергія Глондаря, який перебуває в полоні 672 дні. Ми будемо усе робити можливе, щоб він повернувся до кінця року додому. Тоді, як він попав в полон, це мені віддали з його шкафчика фотографію. Тут хлопці, ті, що, тут всі є, тут більше половини, їх вже нікого нема в живих. 2 групи в нас погибло, район Сніжне. Потім Іловайськ. 42 або 43 чоловіка загинули іменно з 3-го полка.
Чому?
Чушь это все. Нет на востоке Украины никаких российских подразделений.
I think that Putin's attitude towards truth and towards the media is very deeply connected to his training as a KGB officer.
Нет ни специальных служб, нету инструкторов. Это все местные граждане.
And it does go back to some of the original ideas of not just Stalin, but of the Bolsheviks.
One of the things that I found striking looking at the press of the period is you realize how things have changed and how things are the same.
While the masses are starving, the Kremlin is gorging itself with food. There is a greed for power, and power that breeds privileges. There will be a day of reckoning.
So just, I'll give one last summation before I open it up to questions for everyone who's spoken, is that for me, I think, it's important to place Ukraine in the bigger struggle, even though it's always when, people always see, the world through their own eyes. But when we're talking about hunger used as a weapon, we have to remember Yemen, then we have to remember South Sudan. When we're talking about disinformation that is going on, we have to realize that it's something that is happening in the United States, it's happening in Russia. And this film is also very much an exploration of that phenomenon. There is, the problem of the internet has been used by demagogues to create false impressions, false truths, And I think that if Ukraine wants to appeal to, the world community, it has to appeal to it on, with trying to find a convergence of the issues that confront it, instead of always to seek just to be, the victim of the historical tragedies that it has, of course, suffered from, because the world is, it's full of examples that are parallel to this story. And when we reach out to those people, whether it's in Belarus, whether it's in, people in Africa who have been victims of hunger as a weapon, whether we reach out to other journalists who've been killed in Mexico, in in Belarus, in Malta, in Slovakia, then we can make a better case for the freedom that Ukraine deserves itself.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I fully agree. I think, and I get the sense in meetings that I have at the UN and other places that the Ukrainian authorities are really dedicated now and feel strongly about fighting any kind of use, even the term of using food as a weapon of mass destruction. And I think here there is certainly a role for Ukraine to take, a twofold role. One, having experienced this itself in its history in 1932 and 1933 and other years as well, and also as such a major provider of grain for the world, coming in and helping people by, in fact, distributing food. I think this would be a role that could be and should be considered by Ukraine going forward. Thank you very much for both movies. Perhaps I would ask Archbishop, Your Grace, would you, I saw you had put your camera on and your microphone on. Would you care maybe to give a few comments on the movie, some of your feelings? What was your reaction? Are you familiar with the movie? Have you seen either of them before? And maybe just give us.
Right now, I'm running away from, there's some renovations going on in the neighboring facility, and it's not somebody sawing the floor for me to fall through. So I'm sorry about that noise. I've just run into a more distant corner of the house. What I, would like to, first of all, I want to thank Andrew Takat for those very evocative and inspiring movies, and for the work that he's been doing. I have not seen the full length of the films, but I think we're all encouraged to do so. And maybe you can, share that link with the Vimeo here in the chat, Andre, because I think you've got it. Or what I want to make a link that might not be clear to people that don't understand the full history of this Maidan. Because the question is, okay, we show the Maidan and we show the war. What's the link? Why is there a war after the Maidan? Why should there be a war after the Maidan? There's one simple reason. It's not Crimea and the, let's say, ports. It's not the question of defending Russian speakers in Ukraine, as has been portrayed by Russia and often repeated even by CNN and others. For about a year, CNN, BBC, and others would show a map of Ukraine divided between Ukrainian and Russian speaking. That was the purported reason for the war. Putin is coming in to defend Russian speakers. Putin is coming in to save Crimeans from Ukrainian nationalist government rule. The real reason is the direct connection between Maidan and the war. The Maidan was a movement of dignity. The square was a place of dignity. It was a laboratory for a different kind of society, against corruption, for freedom of the press, and for the dignity of every human being. These three things are of mortal danger to Putin's regime. It is a profoundly corrupt regime in which there's a social contract between Putin and the oligarchs and others who hold power. You can do what you want. You can steal. You can milk the general population as long as you never challenge my rule. And those oligarchs who dare challenge Putin's rule are now exiled, in prison, or dead. Second, Freedom of the press. There's no real freedom of the press in Russia, and there hasn't been for about a decade. It has been scrunched since the beginning of Putin's rule in the first years of the 2000s. Ukraine has a freedom of the press, and it has a strong movement against the post-Soviet corruption. And third, it's the question of the civil, human, religious freedom and dignity of every individual. And the Maidan movement showed that the solidarity developed among people of all confessions who spoke all the languages of Ukraine, who represented all different social backgrounds. That solidarity was strong enough to unseat a government that stood for increasing authoritarianism, a control of the press, and a violation of people's dignity. And the prospects of this movement moving from Ukraine to Russia was very big. So it has to be killed in its cradle. And that is why Putin invaded eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea, to cripple Ukraine, to cripple this movement, to stop it at Ukraine's border. In fact, to thwart it within Ukraine itself. At the time when the war began, I forgot the exact statistic. Natalia, you can correct me. I think Ukraine was down to less than 10,000 battle-ready troops.
It was about 6,000, I think, 6,400.
6,000. In 1992, I think it had well over 1 million uniformed troops. Ukraine was the first country in the world in human history that unilaterally gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994. In the US, England, France, and Russia, in different forms, guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity. Ukraine gave up its nukes, Russia attacks, cuts off pieces of the country, and the powers, the European powers in the US, stop a few hundred Russian oligarch hoodlums from shopping at Harrods in London. That's how strong the reaction was. You know, a few sanctions. It wasn't until the downing of the Malaysian airliner, when almost 300 innocent people were killed by a Russian missile launched by the separatists, that the European community started to react more seriously. But this is a war of ideals, totalitarianism and authoritarianism against democracy, control of the human being and human dignity, freedom of the press, and propaganda. That is really what this war is about, and that's what Andrii's films are showing. That is why the people are willing to sacrifice their lives and have been doing so for 7 years.
Thank you, Your Grace. Absolutely. I think very few people understand that the future of Europe depends on the future of Ukraine, now more than ever. What Europe will look like in 20 years will certainly depend on what Ukraine looks like in 20 years. And I think this battle that has been going on, it's not just that Ukrainians have been fighting to go to Europe, but also Ukrainians have been fighting for the freedoms that Europe professes. And in fact, they have been fighting for Europe. And I don't think that everybody quite understands that on the part of the European Union and other places. Natalia, perhaps you could follow up and maybe speak on a few things. First of all, in the movie Hunger for Truth, we already hear about misinformation in the 1930s. We know about Walter Duranty. Maybe some of you have seen the film Mr. Jones, Agnieszka Holland's film about Gareth Jones. What perhaps you can tell us a little bit about this, about the fight for accurate information about the Ukraine Crisis Media Center and commenting on the freedom of press. In Ukraine, there is a larger freedom of press, but there are big interests behind those who own the press. What does that all mean for Ukraine today? Natalia, I give you the floor.
Right. Thank you, Andre. And also thank you to Takat for these, two very important films. I think if there is a chance that more of the English and other, language speaking audiences can see and reflect on these stories, that is certainly helpful. When Andre, you say that a lot depends on Ukraine for the future of Europe, I think a lot depends on the global collaboration in defending the truth. Because Russia has been investing in the truth decay for years, for dozens of years, for centuries. And in 2014, towards the end of the Revolution of Dignity, we were, as Ukrainians, shocked to just this huge new wave of misinformation against the truth that we experienced in Maidan, and also against the events as we saw them unfolding in 2014 that was happening. Because at the time, as this film shows, people thought there were green men in Crimea. In fact, they were, regular military forces of Russia annexing this island, because in this way they wanted to cripple and destabilize Ukraine. And then also the same scenario repeated in the east of Ukraine. I recall when in 2014, we had a difficulty of explaining to our Western partners that it's not a civil war that is taking place in Ukraine, that real civil wars in other countries would love to have the ammunition that Russia had provided to the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. And unfortunately, one of those books really, shot a foreign plane that, completely changed the world's perspective on what really was happening on the ground in Ukraine. You asked me to talk a little bit about UCMC. I think Ukraine Crisis Media Center happened as a, kind of voluntary willingness from myself and a few other people on the ground who we were not NGO people. We all came from, either business or international relations or other tracks of life, but we were just so shocked, again, at this level of misinformation that we thought we have to organize some sort of hub of information where in multiple languages we can tell the truth about what was taking place on the ground. And for a few first years, we would collaborate with other friends from organizations like Stop Fake, from Euromaidan Press, and others whom I recommend you to follow and to read, because they continue their efforts till today, to spread the truth. And to show, for example, that Josip Zisels, who is the head of the Ukrainian Jewish Association, would come to our press briefings and tell exactly this story, that people of different backgrounds and denominations stood in solidarity for all of these months when Russia was trying to portray Ukraine as an anti-Semitic country, or that there were Russians that needed protection in Ukraine. So we would invite representatives of actual Russian nationals who were coming and testifying that, no, we don't need protection in Ukraine. We're actually escaping Russian authoritarianism in Ukraine, and we prefer to live and practice either business or their profession in a free and a democratic country. But I would say in about 2 years, 2-3 years time, we understood that also the mission of Ukraine Crisis Media Center is to continue to build more long-term resilience of Ukraine, and to build a better understanding of our Western allies, of these links between the history and what's happening today. Because what happened in Salisbury when was with the poisoning of a Russian national in a town in the UK, or the attack on democracy and democratic elections even in the United States, those are all parts of the same problem and of the same aggression that Russia practices towards states that are different, for whom truly to live in an open, free, democratic way is a way of being. And it's not only in the hands of Ukraine to fight it. It truly will take an entire global, community to work on making sure that truth comes back. You mentioned, the challenges we have with our information space, but I think it is very universal now, because in Ukraine in particular, we have a case in which, people who have managed to enrich themselves after Ukraine became independent in 1991, we call them oligarchs. They're the people who usually have made their money, sometimes in an illegal way, based on raw materials, but they are not only business people, they own assets, but they also own politicians. They also own the media through which they influence the identity of people in our country. So we have a number of oligarchs, unfortunately, who are not acting in Ukraine's best interest, and they are media owners. So through them, they translate Kremlin's narratives, and Kremlin's narratives are that, Ukraine is a Western puppet state, or that Ukrainians are incapable to have their own state and will fail at every single attempt. So they're kind of taking the oxygen out of a country and a nation that is, reawakening and developing and changing itself. And I would say that these Russian proxies and oligarchs owned media in Ukraine are probably the biggest threat, because we need to free our information space from them. At the same time, the good sign is that, in the last years since the revolution of dignity, what we have managed to achieve is the reestablishment of very important institutions for Ukraine, like Ukrainian Institute, like Ukrainian Cultural Fund, like Ukrainian Cinematographic Agency, like Ukrainian Arts Agencies. Like, again, Vladika Boris has not mentioned, but, the strengths of Ukrainian Catholic University as this epicenter of innovative thought and the resilience of Ukraine, of Ukrainians is extremely important. And these institutions begin to work more to, I wouldn't be afraid of this word, to kind of, create this modern enlightenment of the nation, because we're only resilient if we are actually aware of our history, if we are aware of these learnings of the terror of the Soviet regime, and if we are making sure that we're preventing it from repeating itself in the 21st century. So all and every support should be given to these institutions, because they are, remarkably important in our ability to defend ourselves. But we can only do that when we defend the truth. So the things that Andrew had filmed about and the parallels he had drawn are very important. But also, I would say, Durante had support of the state, which he represented, and if we vouch more for the Gareth Jones of our world, or of this Canadian journalist who dared to speak and testify the truth, if we dare to support people who are going against the flow in testifying truth in all of our, in whatever we are, that actually is helping Ukraine, because we are fighting our fight, but it's going to take the whole global community to help it.
Thank you, Natalia. I fully agree. The idea of a global community, and I think few people realize that, in fact, Ukraine has been a testing ground for many years for the Kremlin, a testing ground on information sphere, manipulation, testing ground in terms of weapons now in the war in Ukraine, and also, most importantly, probably, or most poignantly, testing the resolve of Western democratic nations. And this follows up to something that the Archbishop mentioned earlier, these paltry sanctions that were put in place that just basically touched on some individuals instead of taking serious action. I think this sign of weakness is only a sign of encouragement to the Kremlin to continue to do more. And I believe what you said too, Archbishop, is true, that, yeah, if for decades and decades you say that we are brothers, we are the same, if one brother wants something, then why wouldn't the other brother want the same thing? So this was something that had to be really killed in the cradle. And this is what brought on the war that is still ongoing. I believe we have a comment or a question from Sister Durston Farnan, who is the Dominican Leadership Conference NGO at the United Nations in New York. Sister Dusty, can I call you Sister Dusty? Is that right? If you could maybe, I've been told that's how to address you. Yeah. So if you could please, I'll give you the microphone for your question. Maybe indicate who that question is for. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a very enriching time. I have learned so much, and I'm so mindful of the trauma that the people of Ukraine have gone through. And but I love the term resilient. And it sounds like we need to continue to pray for your resiliency, because you're still on the forefront of working for justice and truth, as Natalia said. At this moment, I'm wondering, in light of all that you've shared with us today, is there a particular way in which we as Dominicans, and of course, part of our charism, Natalia, is to search for truth and to speak the truth. Granted, we only know a little bit of it sometimes, but at the same time, how do you think in this world, since we are Dominicans from around the country here, especially in the United States right now, how do you think we as Dominicans can be, what is our role in relationship to Ukraine, if any? Thank you. Anyone can address this.
Who would like to, I'm sorry, was that question directed to Natalia? Is that correct?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Perhaps Metropolitan Buddhist
can start, and then I'll second.
Yeah. Well, dear sister, first of all, thank you for your witness. And I know for all religious communities, this has been a devastating time, because it has been for the communities in our Ukrainian Catholic Church. We lost 7% of our priests and religious in America in this year. You know, I think for all of us in all of our work, first of all, these issues, the people, the suffering, the projects, they need to be part of our prayer. It's very important that, because there's so much passion and so much devastation, that if we are not approaching them from our relationship with God, you know, something's not going to work, or we're going to run out of steam. So I would say to pray for the people who are on the front lines of justice and democracy, religious freedom, freedom of the press in Ukraine. Those are people on the front. Those are people, volunteers. Those are the families at home. Those are young, especially people in the younger generation who are trying to fight, you know, the corruption. Second of all, I would say this information question is very important. Putin's war, as other wars, whether they are hot or cold, is a hybrid war in which weapons, bombs, and etc. are only one aspect of the assault. The main methodology of this cynical warfare is to confuse people. Not necessarily to convince people that, you know, Putin is right, but to have people of goodwill begin to doubt. Oh, it's so complicated over there. We can't, you know, understand. Just let me move on mentally and in terms of my engagement. That is what the disinformation seeks to do. It seeks to bewilder and paralyze people of goodwill. So coming back to the true information, we can really only do that if we have a profound spiritual resilience, a rootedness. So the spiritual rootedness to a truthful narrative, which liberates and leads to action. That would be the third thing. There's so many things that can be done. For example, there are, the Dominicans are present in Ukraine. They're mostly Roman Catholic, but there's a few Eastern Catholic Dominicans. Roman Catholics are about 10% of the Catholic population. 1% of the general population. Eastern Catholics are about 8-9% of the population. Then, maybe there's 20% of practicing Orthodox, but most people are unchurched. There's also a Muslim and Jewish population and a few percent of Protestants. But, for 3 generations, most of the country was under atheist rule, and all church institutions were either destroyed or limited. So, Natalia, Andre, or I, and maybe Andrew also in France, can direct you to, concrete projects. For example, graduates of the Ukrainian University have begun this project called Build Ukraine Together. It's BUR, B-U-R, together in Ukraine is Razum. And they've had over a few thousand volunteers to go for a week or two to just, put in windows for people whose windows have been blown out by the war. There's projects of creating so-called open spaces. The founder of it is actually downstairs participating in some of those renovations. He's just visiting for a few weeks. But these are dormitory spaces for students that come together to live under a few principles, some specific principles. They're not just functional dorm space, but they live together in this open space of social responsibility. There's a lot of need for support of orphans and widows, medical support. The Holy Father responded 4 years ago in a very generous way. He created a project called the Pope for Ukraine, and he had every parish in Europe make a collection. I'm sorry. The renovations started again there. So there's very many worthwhile projects that can be supported. If we are spiritually rooted, if we know what the truth is, then we can engage.
Yes, thank you very much for your, for your willingness to help and for your kind, engagement. I think one thing in kind of spreading the truth and just simply being aware of the truthful sources of information and learning more about Ukraine. I just dropped in the chat box some of the links and happy to share more with Father Brandon so that you can spread in the community. These are some of the English language resources that can be trusted, because I think one thing is just to learn a little bit more, because if we all know a little bit more, as Vladika had mentioned, there are places in the world that we don't know the context, and the context is very important for understanding what's happening in and around Ukraine and in these relations with Russia. Another thing is, for those who work in Ukraine and you have a lot of influence, I'm sure, in your communities, it's important to understand that truly there are these few media in Ukraine that are owned by people who are not acting in the best interest of truth. Some of them are really owned by like odious personalities like Viktor Medvedchuk, who is owner of 3 top news channels in Ukraine, in fact, which is a little bit sad for the moment. He is a devout Soviet KGB Kremlin agent known to the Ukrainian intellectual public as public attorney of some of the most famous Ukrainian dissident, Vasil Stuz, who died in Gulag in mid-80s because Medvedchuk did not defend him and in fact agreed with the conviction assigned by the general prosecutor at the time. Sadly, he's not, taken out of Ukraine's public life. He's present in Ukrainian politics, and he also is a, very close ally of Putin, and he continues to own media who, put this Russian optic on what Ukrainian audience has to listen to. Russophobia and fascism and failed state and Western puppet and civil war, all of these narratives are being imported and disseminated. So it's important to be aware of that and to know that these media channels are not to be trusted because they're just, transmitting the same message that is not to construct and to build, but to destroy any ability and lose face. And I think the most important thing is, you're the best at helping people believe in themselves, believe in their, having faith in their strengths to change the country. I think in the last 6 years, through this movement of volunteership, Ukraine has really become a nation with more and more active volunteers, people who take this personal responsibility for smaller, bigger projects like BUR, which Vladika had mentioned, like the restatement of PLAST, which is Ukrainian scout organization, that now is regaining its strength and developing in more and more regions in Ukraine and working with youth. And there are other organizations that that are important in that. So I think in helping to build this resilience is where your help would be needed most.
Thank you. I just want to point out, if everyone would just take a look at the chat, and you can copy and highlight and paste them into your Word document. This is in response to what are some of the sources that we might look at, that trusted sources that we might be able as Dominicans to follow up on.
I also just want to mention one thing, that also you could do. Remember Ukrainian political prisoners. There are still Ukrainians that are now suffering in the Russian prisons, like Alexander Marchenko, who's been, sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, despite the evidently flawed nature of charges against him and his consistent account of torture inflicted by militants in the east of Ukraine. I will drop a note here in chat. We're asking everybody to write to Alexander Marchenko, even just a few words to tell him, he's in Russian, but he's not forgotten. These letters need to be in Russian, and there is a little text in Russian just basically telling him that we're wishing him courage and patience and hope that soon he would be released, just as all of the other people who have suffered as him.
Thank you. Thank you.
So maybe also, if I could follow up on that, Natalia, I think there are a lot of things being organized by diasporas in many of the places where the people listening here today and the Dominicans are throughout the world. And one thing that comes to mind, for example, is that we've organized in Switzerland at the Parliament something called Ukraine Forum, and Natalia has taken part in fact, in every one of them. We have a wide variety of people who come and take part in these outreach sort of programs, advocacy programs, including the nuncio for Switzerland, including members of the faculty from Freiburg. So perhaps reaching out to local communities, Ukrainian communities where people are currently residing, and seeing if there are things that are going on, and just by supporting them, by going there, by talking to other people, letting them know. I think this is already a big step. Spreading the truth. I'll quote you, Natalia, on that. I had written it down, but I agree. Spreading the truth. I think that this is the best way. In the US, we've seen this in the last year, in this election year. The amount of disinformation, misinformation, just outright lies and propaganda that people have been exposed to is frightening. This is not just something limited to countries like Ukraine. The whole world is exposed to this now. Michael McChesney wrote this book a long time ago in the 90s called Rich Media, Poor Democracy. And I think one part of this is that our medias are now owned by big conglomerates that really don't have any allegiance to any particular social ideas or values. It's just about making money, getting the most views, getting the most clicks. And so sensationalism is added into a lot of stories that are just untrue because it's a commercial endeavor. And I think this is something that's very important, that we do identify what are good sources of information. And also, I think, you know, corruption is a problem everywhere. I mean, this is not limited to Ukraine. I think there's a good bit of corruption in all places in the world, I can safely say, including in Switzerland. We just don't call it corruption. We call it copinage in French, which sounds nicer, you know, just doing business with friends. Copinage is a better word. But I think whatever the euphemism you use in your particular country, I think shining light into dark spaces, I think is another way of getting involved and not tolerating, you know, this at any level, really having zero tolerance for this abuse and lack of a show of dignity towards people. That's maybe what I would like to add to that.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much. We just see in our chat box for those who can see it easily. And we will post to Dom Life that information under Dominican Month for Peace. Just give us about 48 hours or so, just to make sure it's published in a decent way and user-friendly. The idea of letter writing campaign seems like a practical thing many of us could do. I know a number of you have led in the midst of a lot of other conflicts in other regions of the world. I'm really in the presence of lots of mentors who have been in the midst of the struggle and other struggles throughout the world. Just mentioning all those resources from the video link will also be a part of that messaging out. Also, just calling to mind, a number of us are learning through the month of peace. Just lift up two Dominican ministries that some of us are now a little more familiar with. One of them is the Institute of Religious Sciences in Kiev, which was founded by the Dominicans at their priory, is the home of education, of remembering social consciousness, of preparing ministers for, in some cases, the front lines. Some of that includes programming that has to do with emotional, mental health, a number of other aspects of life in the midst of the war. On the front lines, we're not the only ones, but lifting up those particular programs, preparing ministers to be in service and ministry, accompanying people in the midst of the war in the fronts. I want to lift up also the St. Martin de Porres Center in Festif, which is founded by the Dominicans and are served by Dominican Order, offering now over 220 children orphanage, a place of refuge and home. Those who have been directly affected by the war or parents have been disappeared or killed in the midst of these years of struggle. So as some of us have been sharing that incredible news. I see Mary Bridget and so many of you who have given incredible updates throughout. And thanks to Mike Deeb, thanks to Dusty, who have been championing this on a worldwide scale to let all of our other regions know about this information. We just wanted to lift that up and congratulate you in these efforts. And we add these incredibly important additions to action steps each of us can do. We want to be conscious of our time. We are really grateful for the commitment of our panelists, an astounding group of them who have shared with us today. Before I mention them and thank them, let me just stop and remember there are three people behind the scenes today that some of us may know are there, especially if you're speaking French or Spanish. You certainly know they're there because you're connecting with them. I want to lift up them because they each in their own right have had prominent experiences of ministry. Let me mention Michel Cote. He's a friar of the province of Canada, former promoter for justice and peace, province of Canada, founder of the Canadian Organization Development and Peace in Canada. He's a professional interpreter for many peace and justice networks. Many of you know him, and for the Canadian Bishops' Conference, among other networks across the world. Also want to lift up, congratulate Raymond Latour. He is the Socius of the Provincial of the Province of Canada, who also has helped us with French today and has served for over 30 years in the Canadian Vicariate of Japan. I also want to mention our Spanish interpreter, Cristobal Torres, a Dominican friar from the United States Southern Province, who serves in his campus ministry at Barry University, an Adrian Dominican-sponsored institution. I just want to lift them up because you're not seeing them, but they've made these 2 hours possible.
Father Brendan, how about if we all clap publicly for them to say thank you? Thank you for them translating for us for the last 2 hours.
And you know, let me first start with you, Andre. This is kind of a dream of ours this summer. We were talking about this. This has been near and dear to your heart. Our Ukrainian community have been educators of us. I'm one of the ignorant ones still learning about the Ukrainian experience and histories that once knowledge is known, then we're responsible for sharing it, right? But I just appreciate Andre Lushnicki from the American College Program at the University of Fribourg, our Dominican University in Switzerland, for many things you're doing, but especially for launching Ukraine Forum. He was one of the pioneer voices for making that possible, and a link with the Swiss Parliament and other allies, some of them who are on this panel today. And I congratulate you for your efforts of keeping the voice of Ukraine in front of the world community. And speaking of in front of the world community, I do want to honor first and foremost the new surprise guest first, Andrew Takat. Thank you so much. Some knew him as obviously correspondent producer for CNN, CBS, 60 Minutes, and the producer filmmaker. You're doing the vital work of getting the news out to the world, of speaking truth. What a true Dominican tradition. You lift up as our carers in the heart to Veritas. Natalia Popovich, thank you so much for your commitment to dignity of Ukraine. You have been a co-founder to Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and unbeknownst to us, let us lift up her voice among those on the front lines of getting true, authentic news out to the world, even at risk to your own bodily health. So we really appreciate your efforts. We need to ally with you and continue to remember in solidarity your work. And I also want to thank our beloved Archbishop Metropolitan Boris Gutsiak. Thank you so much for putting a reminder to all of us of leadership in church. Reminds us that you speak the gospel of justice by your words. Very inspiring today. Thank you for your commitment to us in sharing and celebrating this important webinar for us, which will be recorded. Any final words?
Brendan. Thank you, Sister Dusty, as well, for taking the initiative and for reaching out. It's been a pleasure. I hope that I can ask my fellow panelists to, if they have additional materials they would like to send, they can send them to me and I can compile them if you like, and send you maybe a Word document with links to videos or to other documentation online, etc. So if that's necessary, please let me know. I will be glad to reach out to them.
Great.
And especially thank you for all that you're doing in this Dominican month for peace. Father Brendan and I knew each other 30 years ago. We met in Fribourg, of all places. And I really haven't seen him since, apart, I think, in Chicago. I remember visiting your family in 1992, I believe it was. So I'm looking forward to seeing you and Sister Dusty in Geneva, I hope soon. Whenever you're able to travel, I hope to be able to welcome you with open arms when you come to Switzerland. Thank you.
Wonderful. And recognizing Father Mike Deeb and Anieti Okure, who are accompanying us. Thank you for your leadership, Father Mike, and for your new leadership, Anieti. We wish you blessings in the leadership team with Dusty and others. Thank you all. We are recording this webinar. We appreciate your patience with technology and hanging in there through this panel that truly has touched me. It gives me a lot of work I have to do on getting plugged in and sharing this story. So with that, we bid you adieu. We ask blessings and health to all of you. May God bless the people of Ukraine, and may God gift us with dignity, respect, and love.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao. Ciao. Goodbye.
Thank you for the initiative. Thank you.
Thanks for everything. Yeah, a pleasure. Be well.